Today we are going to be looking at Psalm 90, and it is unique because it is the only psalm from Moses. It's not the only song or poem from Moses. There are others in the Old Testament. We read in Exodus 15 and in Deuteronomy 32, but this is the only song of Moses included in the Psalter. Now, Moses lived about 300 years before David, who wrote most of the Psalms, or many of the Psalms. So this is most likely the oldest psalm, written maybe 3,300 years ago. Now, the setting for Psalm 90 isn't known for sure, but one commentary suggested Numbers chapter 20, as this is a tumultuous time in Moses' life. And when we read in the chapter, we first discover that Moses' sister Miriam dies. And then there's an incident at a place called Meribah. Now, the Israelites have left bondage in Egypt, and they are wandering through the wilderness, the desert, on their way to Canaan, which is the promised land. And they are going through a dry land, and they lack water. And they are frustrated and bitter, and they let Moses know it. And God is being gracious to Moses and says, I've heard the grumbling, and Moses, I'm going to take care of this. There's going to be this big rock, and you're going to speak to the rock, and water will gush out, and it will take care of all the needs of the Israelites. So this is what happens in Numbers chapter 20. And then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. And so Moses was to speak to the rock, and instead he's pretty angry, pretty frustrated. We get that in the text, and he ends up hitting this rock twice. And for that, God will punish Moses, and he will not enter the promised land. And then we read in Numbers chapter 20, a few verses later, that Moses' brother Aaron dies. So when we think of Moses, we tend to think of the kind of Charlton Heston Moses, right? Big, strong, let my people go. He's like a biblical superhero. And he is the man of God. I mean, that's part of the title of Psalm 90. But the Moses we meet here in Psalm 90 isn't so confident. He's not so self-assured. And here's kind of what I'm envisioning is happening as background. And so Moses is in the desert. He's in the wilderness, and he's walking around, or maybe he's Ubered a donkey. And he's got a lot of time on his hands. And he's thinking. It's not going well, right? His brother is dead. His sister is dead. His people, the Israelites, they're perpetually wandering around, and they're homeless. and now he's banished from going into the promised land. So Moses, when we read this psalm, he seems really discouraged. And maybe you, like me, at times get thinking, right? And maybe get discouraged. Maybe a little frustrated, and maybe to say, "What's the point? I think I'm doing the right thing, but it doesn't seem like it's not working out." Maybe you're in your own personal wilderness, and maybe you feel a bit hopeless at this point. Well, Psalm 90 is for all of us. So the first 13 verses, we read about Moses' kind of hopelessness. And a lot of this is because God's judgment of sin has led to a short life of suffering. So we begin by reading in verse 1 and 2 of Psalm 90. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. Now, these verses will serve as an anchor for Moses, even though he is struggling in this psalm. Now, dwelling place can also be translated as refuge. So God has been Israel's only refuge. All right? They've either been enslaved in Egypt or they've been wandering around in search of a homeland. And how comforting it is for the Israelites that the eternal God, from everlasting to everlasting, has always been and will always be their refuge. And as we'll see, God has never left them, nor will he ever leave them or us, because of his covenantal, steadfast love. And we'll explore and we'll talk more about this as we get further into the psalm. And then we encounter verses 3 through 11. And these verses are a lament about living under God's judgment. First, there's God's judgment about sin in general. Right? In Genesis 3, because of the fall, when Adam and Eve sinned, all humanity is cursed. And we know specifically about childbirth, and we know about work. We know that will be difficult. But God's judgment of sin and on our unbelief ultimately manifests itself in death. All right, Genesis 2. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. And what does that mean? And that means we will live our short lives under the curse of sin, and then we will die separated from God. Right? Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. And second, there's God's judgment on Israel's sin specifically. So the Israelites are freed from bondage in Egypt. God parts the Red Sea. They pass through. They're in the wilderness. And they're actually not in the wilderness all that long before they encounter Canaan, which is called the Promised Land. And that's where the Israelites will settle. But at this point, they're just coming up on the land. And so they wanted to say, well, what are we getting ourselves into? So they send out spies. And the spies go out to Canaan, and they check it out, and they come back, and they report to the entire body of the Israelites there. And they say, we've got good news, and we've got bad news. The good news is the land's really good. It's going to be a great place to live, right? A land flowing with milk and honey. But the bad news is that the land is occupied by giants, the Nephilim. Okay, so imagine some combination of Nikola Jokic and LeBron James, huge people. And so how do the Israelites react to this news? Well, we read in Numbers 14, then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we died in the land of Egypt, or that we would have died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let's choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Needless to say, this whining is not going to go over too well. Not with Moses and not with God. Because God's performed all sorts of miracles on behalf of the Israelites. And so God pronounces judgment against all the Israelite adults for their rebellion. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. So they will all die. All the adults will die in the wilderness, never entering the promised land. And so Moses is seeing God's judgment unfold in front of him, and it's overwhelming. Right? And so when we begin to read this passage, it kind of reads like Ecclesiastes. You can feel kind of the frustration, the tension as Moses begins. And he says, beginning in verse 3, you return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or a watch in the night. You sweep them away like with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed, but in the evening it fades and withers. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of our life are 70, or by reason of strength 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? So 2 points. Life is short, and life is hard. And life is short, right? And Moses is contrasting the eternal God with finite man. And he does it. Again, the imagery in verses 4 through 6, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or a watch in the night. And then you sweep them away as with a flood. They are a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. You have this contrast, the infinite God, and then us, we just disappear. And then verse 10, right, the years of our lives are 70, or by reason of strength 80. Again, this was written about 3,300 years ago, and it's still accurate. The average life expectancy today for the average American is 76 years. Life is short. And life is hard. All right, I mean, verse 9, for all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. But here's the thing. I mean, Moses is going to confess God's wrath is deserved. God's not being unjust, right? Verse 7 and 8, for we are brought to an end by your anger, by your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. Sometimes we sin in secret, and sometimes we sin very publicly, right? Think about the Israelites and the golden calf they constructed when Moses went up to Mount Sinai and came back with the 10 Commandments. And there's this golden calf that the Israelites are worshiping. We get what we deserve, but we still have to deal with the ugliness of a fallen world. Think about the news. So Moses comes to verse 12. So teach us to number our days so that we may get a heart of wisdom. And what Moses is asking for here is for guidance and prudent living to navigate the difficulties of life. Right? He confesses life is hard, life is short. So how do I live well? And this does sound like something out of Proverbs, right? But here's the thing, it is helpful, certainly not discouraging anybody for asking for wisdom from God, but Moses wants more from God than good advice. He wants his mercy, he wants his love, and he wants his presence. Moses had dinner with God. Read that in Exodus 24, verses 9 through 11. And at one point, God hid Moses in a mountain and then caused his glory to pass by. But now, for Moses, God seems so distant and so remote. And then Moses finally breaks down in verse 13. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. And Moses cries out for pity and for relief, and he feels rejected and tormented. How long is this misery continuing? How much longer do we have to go on suffering? When will God show mercy and return to his beleaguered people? And Moses is, yes, Lord, yes, the Israelites have behaved badly, and there's no denying that, but Lord, we are still your people. And maybe at some point, maybe even now, maybe you feel some ways like Moses, right? Maybe you've been in the wilderness and you feel your faith is weak, and you find yourself becoming cynical or defeatist or just indifferent, numb. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servant. But there is hope and there is encouragement. And Moses will have hope because of God's covenantal love, and that will bring him joy and gladness. Verse 14, satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. And to me, this is the key verse in the psalm. But before we go there, just real quick, remember verse 1, where God's presence or refuge has been the only constant for Israel. And why is that? Because of God's steadfast love, what's called hesed. That's what it sounds like in the Hebrew. God's hesed, or his steadfast love. And this was expressed by his covenant or arrangement with Abraham, who was known as Abram, back in Genesis 12. We read in Genesis 12, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and he who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, this covenant is considered a unilateral covenant. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, most covenants were conditional. They were like contracts, right? So if one side doesn't live up to the terms, there are penalties. Now, this covenant that God made was unilateral or unconditional. And what does that mean? That means that God will do all of the work. Nothing is required from Abraham but to trust and believe God. Now, God cannot be unfaithful to his word or to his promises. He will bless his people with steadfast love, hesed, if they trust in him. And God then displayed his hesed, right? He blessed Isaac. He blessed Jacob. He blessed Joseph. And then he delivered the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. And even in the wilderness, God provides manna and quail to take care of their needs. And even at Meribah, God provides abundant water when they needed it. God shows his hesed. So God has been faithful with steadfast love. He will not forsake his people. He will uphold his covenant. He will be our refuge for all generations. And this is Moses' hope, and this can be our hope too. So whatever you do, hang on to this verse. And Moses also in verse 14 is speaking of contentment, of being satisfied. And Moses, again, he had worldly power and glory. He was, if you recall, he was kind of adopted into Pharaoh's family, right? You've seen Prince of Egypt, or old school, 5 hours of the 10 Commandments, right? And Moses literally had it all. But Moses exchanged fellowship with the king of Egypt for fellowship with the king of the universe. And this led Moses out of Egypt and into the wilderness. However, as long as he could worship God each morning, he always had a home, he had a refuge, and for this, he could forever rejoice. He continues in verse 15, make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Moses knows his time is short. His generation is dying, and a new generation is arising. Moses' generation had seen the Exodus, right? They had seen God's mighty work of deliverance. And what he prays is that the younger generation will also know of God's power and glory as it is displayed to them. Moses is thinking of the future of Israel, that the upcoming generation may be faithful in ways that his generation wasn't. And then verse 17, let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. And favor of the Lord in verse 17 can also be translated as beauty of the Lord. And this is quite a contrast from the previous verses, right? Verses 3 through 11, right? To see God's beauty, to experience his favor and not his anger. And God's favor would be seen in establishing the work of the Israelites, and this could be referring to eventually reaching and settling in the promised land. Moses prays for God's favor upon Israel in their pilgrimage to the promised land, even though he will not see them enter it. And so a major theme here in Psalm 90 is hope, right? It's about finding hope in the wilderness. And today is Father's Day, and as dads, we have hopes and dreams for ourselves and our families. And some come true, and some don't. And as dads, we can get discouraged. And Moses, he won't be entering the promised land. This isn't the ending he was hoping for. And he is discouraged, and he needs hope. But God is faithful and gracious in ways we can't even imagine. For God does not take Moses into the promised land, but instead he will take him somewhere better. And we read about Jesus and his transfiguration in Matthew 17. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothing became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make you 3 tents here, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And as he was still speaking, when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Moses had ascended Mount Sinai to meet with God. And now Jesus, the Son of God, Emmanuel, God incarnate, ascends a mountain to meet with Moses. And the transfiguration is a foreshadowing. It's a foretaste of heaven. And that is the ultimate fulfillment of verse 1 in Psalm 90, that God will be our dwelling place forever. In Deuteronomy 34, Moses ascended to a place called Pisgah. It's on top of Mount Nebo. And from there, he was able to see the promised land just before he died. Now Moses has entered the eternal promised land. And God said in verse 5, this is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. The ultimate Father's Day gift isn't a gift from us to God the Father, but rather a gift from God the Father to us in the form of his Son Jesus. Moses was constantly interceding and intervening on the part of the wayward Israelites before God, asking, God, please relent. And God was gracious, but still the guilt of the Israelites remained, and they were punished. Jesus died on the cross as a sacrifice to atone or pay the penalty for our sins. He's able to intercede for us in a way that Moses never could. Those who place their faith and trust in Jesus are forgiven their sins, declared righteous by God, and brought into his family, and will dwell with him forever. Receive Jesus today by faith. Psalm 90 is for those of us who get discouraged, bitter maybe, weary, which is most Christians, right? As we're going through this pilgrimage in this fallen world. And the journey from slavery to the promised land goes through the wilderness. It is easy to lose hope. But we can find hope in Jesus who will sustain us. And even in the wilderness, God will be our dwelling place, and he will satisfy us with his hesed, his steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all of our days.